Hello and welcome to Around the Clock. I'm your host, Yolanda Greaves. Today in studio, we have Michael Herbert, the town manager for the town of Ashland. Michael, welcome back to Around the Clock.
Hey, Yolanda. Thanks for having me.
It's been a little bit since we've had you here at Around the Clock.
I know. My feelings were getting a little hurt.
No, don't, please.
Oh.
We know you're busy.
Yes.
So we don't always want to take your time. But today we've brought you here to start talking about the budget process, right?
Yeah.
We're getting to be in the thick of it. Town meeting's coming up in May. We're looking at what our departments are needing to be able to do their jobs. So we brought you in to really talk through what is the budget process for a town like Ashland. But why don't you start with giving us a little bit of your finance background that people may not be aware of?
Right. So Yolanda, I'm town manager now. I just celebrated my 9th anniversary, going in my 10th year. And a lot of people, who moved into town during that time, they don't know that before that I was the finance director. Right. And I kind of chuckle, when you were interviewing me for town manager,
right.
I'm known now as kind of like this creative, vision type of guy. But I was known as the numbers guy back then. And you were like, well, how are you going to transition from being, the numbers guy to more the big picture guy? So before I came here as the finance director, I worked in the city of Newton. I was the performance management director there and worked on the budget. And then before that, I was in the city of Lowell. And that's really where I learned municipal finance from a guy who was a genius. His name's Tom Moses. And he moved on from the city of Lowell to become town administrator in Hudson. So
that seems to be a path. You do finance for a few years, you become an assistant town manager, and eventually a town manager somewhere. For municipal government, that's a path.
Yeah, and this will lead me into an important point I want to make, because originally when I got into municipal government, or I was studying government, I was studying to be a planner. That's my undergrad. And that was really kind of the focus of my master's. And then at some point, I had no interest in the money piece. And then I started realizing when I was doing my master's thesis that, you need the money to actually do the things that you think about and want to do.
Yeah.
And so that's how I got interested into finance. So, finance is boring. It really is. Hey, unless you're a special kind of person, right? But it's the most important aspect of a community, of an organization.
Definitely.
Because you talk about services, you talk about doing infrastructure projects. What underpins all of that is funding.
And the financial ability to do anything that you want to do in a community is so important.
Correct. Any operation you see has some kind of dollar attached to it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's your background. Mm-hmm. Let's start big picture.
Sure.
Right? We're talking about the budget. Where does it all start? And I know it's a fluid thing, right? It's not like we start. It keeps going. It's cyclical every year. So we're heading into fiscal year 26. When did you start having these discussions?
Right. So for fiscal year 26, which is actually starts on July 1st of 2025. Mm-hmm. That's fiscal year 26. So for that budget, which is coming up, we actually started work in November. And so basically that starts with, basic revenue estimates, very, very early revenue estimates, just some general thoughts and ideas about the budget. And that in turn goes out to the department heads in the school department. And so they start developing their budgets at that point in time. And from there, they submit the budgets, at least the non-school departments, what we call the municipal departments. That's like police, fire, DPW. So those departments usually submit their budgets by December, or at some point in December.
Right.
And from that point, our finance director, who's Brittany Capone, she starts assembling those. And really, that's when, in January, is when you really start crafting a budget, a full budget with revenue estimates and expenditure estimates. And so you basically follow that process, which is laid out partially in the charter and partially through policy, which has a heavy public input component as well. Yep. You follow that process throughout the winter and spring until May, which is when we have town meeting. And town meeting is the actual expenditure authority for appropriated expenses in Ashland.
How does the process end? What's the back half of it?
Okay. So it's important to note that even at town meeting, what town meeting is voting on is still at that point an estimate of not only the revenues, but the expenditures. And another important point I should make is that they're only voting on the expenditures. They don't vote, there's no vote on a revenue estimate.
Okay.
So from that point, it's the town accountant, who's also our finance director, because they do
Small
two jobs.
Town, they do two things. Yep.
So she starts working on closing out the fiscal year that ends June 30th, going into July 1st. So that process takes a while because, you're making sure that you're counting every invoice that gets in, making sure you're trying to get every invoice in, trying to, get every encumbrance, which is, permission to spend into the next fiscal year, all of that taken care of. Get that done and close out the books, because at that point, hopefully at that point, we have a balance at the end of the year, meaning that our revenue was more than our expenditures as we've gone throughout the year. And so what happens at that point is that gets sent to the State Department of Revenue. And they do something they call certify it. They call certify it. And if you have a balance, it's called free cash. Not really sure
which
where
is
it comes
not
from.
free and it's not cash, really.
It's not free. It's not cash. It's a number on a spreadsheet somewhere, but it is real money and can be appropriated once the state certifies it.
Okay.
And then a town doesn't have to have a town meeting in the fall, but we have traditionally done that. And in some cases, we have adjusted expenditures for that fiscal year or made new expenditures, just like we did this past fall.
Yep.
And so at that point, you basically have all of your expenditures, everything in place, your planned expenditures for that fiscal year. And then you send all of that to the state, and they certify what they call your tax rate, which is basically a multiplier that they use in calculating your tax bill. And once that is certified, we can send out the tax bills that are due in January.
Okay.
Now, the tax bill you see in January is going to be different than the one that you see in September or October. Excuse me. Brittany, don't kill me. Or Cindy, I should say. That sometimes causes a lot of confusion. Probably won't get into it right now, but.
So just real quick though. So the first half, so from July through December, that's called an estimated tax bill based on maybe what you paid last year or what your rate was the year before. And then after we've certified the free cash and we've been able to set the new tax rate, which happens in November or December with the select board meeting, then the actual tax bills can come out in January, and they might be slightly different, either higher or lower, based on the tax rate that's been set and the potential value of the home, right? I mean, those are some things to think about.
Correct. And the expenditures.
Right.
So that those are the controlling features of, calculating your tax bill.
Right.
And yes, so we do quarterly tax bills here.
Yep.
And like you said, the first two in the fiscal year, which is actually the ones in the latter half
of the calendar year,
are estimates. And then, yes,
Right.
you have what the actual bills are in the third and fourth quarter.
Okay. So that's sort of the budget and finance process. Right. As people are watching us have these discussions at select board meetings, at finance meetings, at school board meetings, there's different terminology that we hear. We hear Chapter 70, we hear UGA, circuit breaker, cherry sheet, excluded debt, included debt, different things like that. Let's start with the cherry sheet, right? Because that's information coming from the state. How does that impact us?
Yeah, so the cherry sheet is actually what they call the basically the instrument that tells you what your state aid is, or the money that you're getting from the state. It also has what the money that you have to give back to the state as well. We can't forget that. Right. And so it was actually back in the day printed on red paper. So that's why they call it the cherry sheet. And so that is part of the revenue component
Mhm.
in the town budget.
And somewhat of the expense too, right?
Correct.
Right.
If it is
Yeah.
correct on the expenditure side. Correct.
Right. And if you're watching, you can actually go see what our cherry sheet is by going to the state website and, mass.gov and looking what our potential incoming funds from the state are going to be.
Yeah. Correct.
And on that cherry sheet, what are some of the funds or what are some of these things that we're going to see?
Yeah, I think your two biggest ones that you're going to see. The first one is going to be Chapter 78. Chapter 78 is aid that is given based on a very complex formula that the state put together after the Education Reform Act was passed in the 90s. And so basically it gives you money for your schools and your school children. And, I will have to say again that formula, there's always opportunities when you have 351 cities and towns and several school districts. There's going to be some towns that do not make out that well.
Mhm.
Ashland was unfortunately one of those.
In the initial formula. Yes.
Big kudos to our Senate President, Karen Spilka, who, a few years ago was able to change that and
She worked very hard. Yeah.
And so, I think we're still a little bit behind, but she made great strides.
Well, and there was a new law passed 3 or 4 years ago, the Student Opportunity Act, which also we've seen some increase in funding because of that formula as well.
Correct. That, and then also, there is a per student component of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so as enrollment has increased,
Right.
we do get more money that way as well.
Right. Okay. So that's Chapter 70. We also hear about UGA or unrestricted government aid.
Right. So
what does that mean?
Yeah, and that's probably your other biggest category on your cherry sheet. And so that is aid just given, for general government services, and it's usually significantly smaller.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are some of the revenue things. So now you've talked a little bit about the budget. We as a select board, we're getting ready to do what's called our tri-board meeting. So we're having discussions with select board, finance committee, school committee. What do you foresee in those discussions? Part of it's what the school needs are, and if I'm watching from the public, I hear about a tri-board meeting. If I were to sit in on one, what can I expect?
Boy, that's a loaded question, Yolanda. No, what could you expect? Well, I think the first part of the meeting, we would talk about revenue, really, and that's probably going to be the focus of the first part of the meeting, and then we talk about the expenditures. And when we do talk about revenue on a local budget, it's really broken down into 4 components. So we talked about state aid.
Yep.
That's one big one. The other big one, of course, is property taxes.
Yep.
And a town like Ashland and some of these suburban towns, you're going to see property taxes make up a significantly larger portion of the revenue than a place like a city, like a gateway city or Boston or Framingham even.
Right.
And so property taxes are a little bit complex in Massachusetts because of a couple laws that have been in place for a while and some of the rules in place. But, the first, I should say that every property is assessed a tax called a property tax for businesses that have equipment and things that they utilize in the operation of their business. They have something called personal property tax. And so that is assessed a value by the assessor of the city or town that you live or work in. And so that, basically that cannot equal that total assessed value for the community cannot total. Well, excuse me. Now I'm getting confused. Even me. I've been doing this forever. So that's basically how you get your property value.
Right.
It's called equalized valuation total. And so from there, you have your first limit on what your property taxes can be. And that's called your property tax ceiling, which can never be more than 2.5% of the full EQV of the town, equalized valuation in town.
It can't be more than 2.5%, or you can't raise it from year to year.
No, it can't be more than 2.5%.
Oh, I don't think a lot of people understand that.
Well, that is one component of Prop
2.5
that a lot of people do not understand. You're right, because most people think of the second component,
right,
which says the tax levy, which is usually far below that 2.5% ceiling.
Okay.
The tax levy can't increase year over year more than 2.5%.
Okay.
And it can be done in two exceptions.
Right.
So actually three, but I'll say two. So the first one is called a debt exclusion.
Yep.
And a debt exclusion is a vote by the community to tax over and above that levy limit. An amount equal to what it takes to pay down the debt associated with a large capital expenditure.
So in the past couple of years, we had two large ones. We did the public safety building and we did the Mendez rebuilding of that.
Correct.
And about 15 years ago, we had 4 projects that we did. So that's the excluded debt.
Correct.
Okay. And if I'm looking at my tax bill, am I going to see those separated on my tax bill or not?
You will not see that.
Okay. So it's all just into one
it's
bill.
all just into one. So on the budget, so that amount though on excluded debt though, so that's not folded into your regular levy.
Right.
So you'll see that as a separate number. And that's because that goes away once that bond is paid off.
Correct.
So if you have a 30-year bond, at the end of
after the 30 years,
that goes away.
Yeah.
So
for a lot of communities though, like Ashland, right? We had these projects that we did 20 years ago and we were looking at all that debt and said, okay, when it's done, it's going to go away. But then we had more capital needs and we had to do more of that excluded debt to do some of those projects.
Yeah. And maybe we need to rephrase that because, at the end of 30 years, that the dollar amount the taxes that you pay associated to that project from 30 years ago goes away.
Right.
Now you might have voted new projects along the way, which that would be reflected.
Right.
There. Right. But, it's not like at the end of 30 years, it's not like the tolls on the pike, for those of you that know.
That were supposed to go away.
That were supposed to go away once the pike was paid for.
Right.
But instead they decided to move it towards the big dig. Sorry, anyway.
No,
I went on a tangent.
Well, but I think that's important to note, right? Because people have looked at excluded debt here in Ashland and said, okay, we have this debt that's going along and it's going to drop off. So our taxes are going to go down. But as a community, we made the decision to say, okay, well, because we know this other debt is going to be dropping off, we are, as a community, voting to add new debt so that as this drops off, this new debt comes on. Right.
And I will say that, if you remember when we were doing the public safety building in the Mendez school, we tried to time it and set it up. And I tried to structure the bonds to where, or the debt to where it would, as some was falling off, that's when the bulk of the new one was coming on.
So it wasn't all at the same time.
Yeah, you wouldn't try to get a huge spike.
Yeah. So we've talked about the process. We've talked about some of this terminology. We've talked a little bit about, the tri-board meetings and those discussions. If I've watched this, where can I go on the website to say, okay, what did we spend in 2025? What are we expecting to spend in 2026? And how else can I follow up on this discussion?
I think the best thing to do, probably the one web page that has the most comprehensive information would be Brittany's page, the accountant and finance director page.
Okay.
So if you just go to the web page, you look at departments, accounting, finance, click on that. If you look at the menu on the left, you're going to find access to the budgets, our financial policies, the audits that are done each year, and a number of other financial related things. And then I would suggest people start with the actual budget document for the fiscal year. Our finance team spends a significant amount of time putting together a budget document that is very comprehensive. Usually when we have the capital plan rolled into it, it's 400 pages.
Right.
Now it's a light, went on a diet. It's like at 300 pages now. But, I don't want them to think that they have to read 300 pages because
Right.
Brittany does a really good job of doing like an executive summary,
Mm-hmm.
kind of give you, kind of the bird's eye view of what's going on. But that has everything you're going to want to know
Okay.
about the town. Org charts, staffing levels, all that good stuff.
Good. Well, Michael, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I think this has been very helpful. And to those of you watching, check out the website, go look at things. And if you have questions, reach out to Michael, reach out to his team, reach out to any of the select board members or finance committee members, because we are here to work for you and take us through this budget process.
Yeah, don't be shy. I
Yeah.
love talking about
Yeah.
finance. I'm probably one of the few people that do. So take advantage of it.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on Around the Clock.
My pleasure.
That wraps up this interview with Michael Herbert, the Ashland Town Manager, regarding finances and the budget process here in Ashland. Thanks for watching.